Good morning, class. Today we are going to be talking about Kennedy and the Cold War. You left off with Mr. G going over the 1950s, and hopefully one of the last things that you talked about was the Eisenhower administration and the Cold War, time period known as the Cold War thaw. So before we start Kennedy, we're just going to take a look back real quick and talk about this thaw just for a second. Basically, this Cold War thaw was a peaceful time in the late 1950s. After Stalin had died, the new Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev wanted to compete with the United States and wanted to compete with the United States scientifically and economically rather than through arms races and nuclear war and ending humanity as we know it. This all had to do with Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policy. One of the things that um, One of the ways that they competed during this peaceful coexistence or Cold War thaw was through basically they competed economically through consumer goods. Yes, the Soviet Union did have consumer goods, but the major focus was the space race. All right, if you look at my little arrow here, I don't know if you can see it, but 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik. All right, the first artificial satellite. A month later, they put the first living dog in outer space, Laika. We were behind the Soviet Union, so this became very symbolic during this Cold War thaw that the Soviet Union was ahead of us in the space race. That they could even spy on us if they wanted to from outer space, even though we had the technology to spy from high altitudes. The Soviet Union was winning the space race. There's a picture of Laika, the first dog in outer space. And again, we launched Explorer in 1958. We could jump ahead to 1961 when Kennedy was already president, when the Soviet Union puts the first cosmonaut in outer space, Yuri Gagarin, who circumnavigates the whole Earth and returns safely. A month later, we try to send Alan Shepard into space. So this was a disaster. We'll talk more about the space race when we talk about NASA with Kennedy, but we were lacking behind the Soviet Union. And this was symbolic during this Cold War thaw when we were supposed to be winning. We're capitalists, a democracy. We're supposed to be winning this war against the Soviet Union, but we were losing the space race. So this Cold War thaw heats back up in 1960, right at the end of Eisenhower's administration. All right, we have Kennedy coming in, Eisenhower leaving. The CIA decided to run high altitude spying missions via U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union without Eisenhower's permission. The Soviet Union had shot down this spy plane, and hence the Cold War thaw heats back up. The Soviet Union was not too happy about this. So the election of 1960, Kennedy runs against Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Milhous Nixon. And Kennedy has a lot of charisma. There's a lot of reasons that Kennedy shouldn't have been elected during this time because of his age, his experience, his religion. But Nixon, in the first publicized debate, presidential debate, kind of falls apart. And this works to Kennedy's advantage. It's the first televised debate, and Nixon, I guess, is a little nervous, and he falls apart, and Kennedy wins. So, very slim margin, popular vote and electoral vote, but Kennedy slips by. So, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Kennedy had a very unique way of motivating people of the United States to put forth a great effort, and a lot of good things happened within this country during the 1960s. But there was also some disastrous things that happened under the Kennedy administration as well. So we're going to take a look at both. Kennedy's family, the White House, was often referred to as Camelot. It had this mystique. maybe because of his age and seeing a younger person in the White House, a lot of people were attracted to this. A lot of people were attracted to the fact that his advisors were popular. They were known as the best and the brightest. He had CEOs from Ford Motor Company, deans of Harvard University. His own brother was the Attorney General. So he was very. It was a very personal feeling in the White House. The first dilemma happens in 1959. Starts in 1959 when Fidel Castro has a communist coup in Cuba. He overtakes the island, and it's 90 miles off the coast of the United States. We had a lot of economic interests in Cuba, and the fact that it is 90 miles off our coast when Castro takes it over really catches our attention. And of course, Castro will eventually be supported by the Soviet Union being communist. So Eisenhower, while in office, went ahead and authorized a invasion to overthrow Castro, and it was supposed to take place at the Bay of Pigs. The CIA trained Cuban refugees that left the country, and these exiles, these middle-class Cubans, were trained to overthrow Castro. Problem that arrived is Eisenhower leaves office. Kennedy comes in April. He approves this mission, not knowing much about it, and it's disastrous. All right, they land at the Bay of Pigs. Castro was not caught off guard. In fact, he was well prepared, and this is going to be one of Kennedy's early actions, and it's going to be humiliating. He's got to pay millions in ransom. It makes the United States look weaker, that we can't even overthrow a communist regime 90 miles off our coast. We consider Cuba kind of a banana republic, a weaker nation, and we can't oust the communists there. So Kennedy looks weak. Another thing that Kennedy is not going to be, another decision that's not going to be too popular, was that Kennedy is going to bring us closer and closer to this war in Vietnam that's going to start in the late 60s. Vietnam was divided, much like Korea, after World War II, and the communists got the North and the non-communists got the South. Well, without getting into too much detail, we supported the non-communists, and Kennedy began to send military advisors in 1963. And this begins what we call the quagmire effect, or us getting stuck in Vietnam. So really, Vietnam doesn't really happen until 1966, as a military operation. But Kennedy, as early as 61, begins to get us stuck there. Something else Kennedy became more popular with was his stance against communism in Europe. This was symbolized by the Berlin Wall when the Soviets built it in 1961. You had East Germany, you had West Germany, you had East Berlin, you had West Berlin. The East were communist, the West were democratic. Well, you had communists trying to escape into West Berlin so they can reach West Germany, the Free West. So the Soviets build a wall around West Berlin. Watch the video that I posted this morning. It's very interesting. So Kennedy goes to Berlin to pledge our allegiance as a country to make sure that we are going to protect this tiny half of a city that is democratic. It's really the only symbol of democracy, really, in the East, behind the Iron Curtain after World War II. So this was popular because, again, this showed that we weren't going to back down from the communists in Europe, where we really didn't have interest before. We saw many regimes in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, collapse, and we didn't come to their aid. But Kennedy vows to protect West Berlin, which was huge. All right. One of the biggest crises that happened under the Kennedy administration was the Cuban Missile Crisis. We began to spy on Cuba, and we detected or found missile sites in Cuba, where now the Cubans could, if they launched these missiles, they could strike the United States pretty much anywhere. So you could see that this is a major crisis for us. And now by 1962, you have the full backing of the Soviet Union, of Cuba. So what happens is there's going to be kind of a standstill. Kennedy is going to react by quarantining Cuba, putting the Navy around the island. And for 13 days, nobody really knew what was going to happen. You had more missiles coming in from the Soviet Union, and they reached the quarantine line. If they would have tried to have crossed, this could have meant possibly a nuclear war, not with just us in Cuba, but with us in the Soviet Union. So you could imagine, with all the arms that we had, how disastrous this could be. So towards the end, this was resolved by a secret agreement between Kennedy and Kennedy and Khrushchev, actually, of the Soviet Union. It's known as the swap. We agreed to take missiles out of Turkey that were pointing at the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would take their missiles out of Cuba. And this was followed then again by a hotline, which was a direct line between the White House and Kremlin, so both leaders could continuously talk, so they could avoid a crisis like this again. And something called a limited test ban treaty, where both agree not to test missiles in the atmosphere. So again, because we don't have the time to really get into depth, this was the closest pretty much the country had ever gone into becoming, or should I say, this is the closest that the country had ever come to facing a nuclear war, the world, pretty much, between the United States and Soviet Union, over these missiles in Cuba. But Kennedy proves his resilience here. He doesn't back down from the Soviet Union. Khrushchev is actually forced to resign as the Soviet premier because he looks weak. So this was a victory, a proxy victory for the United States, in the fact that we did get the missiles out of Cuba, which was the dilemma in the first place. So a couple of things about Kennedy's domestic agenda. I know I'm running out of time here. But New Frontier, Kennedy was responsible for creating a Peace Corps, right, to help underdeveloped countries. This was great because this showed how strong capitalism was, that we could send people to help underdeveloped nations. You didn't see the Soviet Union doing this. So the Peace Corps could be looked upon as an instrument to fight communism as well. Kennedy gets the approval for NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Association. He gets Congress to approve $13 billion in spending. Because the Soviets were pulling so far ahead of us, Kennedy wanted to make sure that we were going to land on the moon before the Soviets, which we did in 1969. He begins food stamp programs, making sure that all Americans have a basic standard of living. He's the first Democrat really to address issues of civil rights. He had to be careful here because he is a Democrat, and most of his support comes from Democrats in the South. So supporting civil rights was a tricky business. He used federal agents to continue to enforce the Brown laws and the Civil Rights Act of 1957 to desegregate schools. He uses federal agents to escort James Meredith to Ole Miss. And in 1963, Kennedy launches a new civil rights bill that would have enforced desegregation of all public places. Now, this bill enters the floor of Congress and begins to get filibustered, passed around basically by his own party until it expires. So right before the election, Kennedy is going to try to address civil rights a little bit more. The election of 1963. So, like I had said, that issue that we talked about in the beginning with the space race, Kennedy gets $13 billion approved, and we are going to begin our program, our space program, which is going to pull us ahead of the Soviets, NASA. All right. May 25th, 1961, Kennedy gave a speech challenging America to land on the moon. And by July of 1969, unfortunately, Kennedy was not around to see this. We know that we take our first steps. There's Neil Armstrong planting the flag on the moon. Some say that that's a conspiracy, but we won't get into that. There is Cape Canaveral in Florida, where the Apollo missions and many other space apparatuses have launched from since. And on the right is Mission Control in Houston, Texas. All right, last thing we'll talk about is the assassination of Kennedy. All right, again, right before the election, Kennedy runs as the incumbent Democrat. He is once again on the campaign trail trying to get his legislation more popularized, his civil rights legislation, and he's going to go to the South. He's going to go to Dallas, Texas. And in Dallas, Texas, he's going to be shot by Lee Harvey Oswald from the 6th floor of the Book Depository building. Before Oswald, again, this shot was fatal. It killed Kennedy. There was 2 shots, one that went through his throat and one, the famous headshot on Elm Street, which, you know, all the conspiracy theories derive from. But as we say, as our most accepted theory is that Oswald had shot Kennedy. Oswald was a Castro supporter. But again, before Oswald was interrogated, he's going to be transported from the his local jail cell, where he's going to be murdered by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby. All right, so you know, Oswald's death then ignited controversy, and there's many theories of why certain people wanted Kennedy killed, whether it was the mob. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, declared a war against organized crime, and it was believed that a lot of mafia stuffed ballots for Kennedy to get him elected. So there was this personal vendetta. The Cubans, obviously, for Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis, and even Vietnam is an accepted theory that a lot of people wanted Kennedy killed. So, as we know, we'll stick to the facts here. November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy is shot. All right. There's a picture of Oswald being shot by Jack Ruby. Ruby has his back towards us. If you can see, he's holding a pistol that shoots Oswald. There's Kennedy, his brothers, his 2 brothers, and Jackie, his wife, Robert Jr., down at the bottom. All right, so Kennedy's murder, since there was a lot of controversy surrounding it, the Warren Commission is going to be appointed to investigate Kennedy's murder. And you can YouTube and see the assassination. Not too clear from YouTube, but you can see that, you know, Kennedy is going to be hit through the shoulder, neck area, and that bullet ricochets and hits Governor Conley, who's riding next to him, and wounds him in the knee. And then what appears to be another gunshot from an opposite direction is the fatal one that kills Kennedy. And you can see Kennedy then, you know, obviously keel over and die. Jackie crawls to the back of the car. But this ignited controversy, the grassy knoll controversy, that a second shot came from the grassy knoll. So the Warren Commission does conclude that Kennedy was killed by one lone assassin. But in 1979, the investigation is reopened, and the possibility of a second shooter was accepted. Kennedy is the second president to be buried at Arlington Cemetery, and you can visit his gravesite, the Eternal Flame, today. So, again, I hope that you guys were able to get what you needed from this. If you have any questions, please be ready to talk on live stream tomorrow, and I will see you then.